Good morning, everyone. My name is Nasia Hadjigeorgiou. I am going to be delivering a lecture on introducing human rights to you. The lectures of the slide of the slides of the lecture that I will be using will be made available to you. So here we go. Let's first of all start with a few examples of what we mean by human rights. We have the basics. Usually most people are able to come up with these. We have the right to life, and we have freedom from torture and freedom from slavery. But then we also have rights that one needs in order to live a meaningful and secure life. And these include the right to liberty and security of the person. Usually they are coupled together, these two. The right to a fair trial, the right to private and family life. That includes things like who you get to marry, who you get to live with, what kind of relationship do you get to have with your parents without the state interfering, and so on and so forth. The right to home, where do you get to live and under what conditions. Freedom of expression, what you get to say and what you don't get to say to people in public or in private. The right to marry. Freedom of religion, that includes things like what can you wear? What kind of religious symbols are you allowed to wear in public? We have really famous cases like the French one where the burqa has been banned in public, but then we also have debates in the UK, for example, that focus on questions like are school students allowed to wear religious symbols, and what kind of religious symbols are allowed. Then we have the right to vote, questions like, is everyone allowed to vote? Should everyone be allowed to vote? For example, a very famous British case is whether we should disenfranchise prisoners, whether we should remove the right to vote from the prison population. We have the right to education, who is allowed to be educated and under what conditions, and crucially, in what language. And then we have rights that have less to do with a meaningful life and more to do with a life that can be practically lived, like the right to health, the right to food, and the right to shelter. And then we have, I'm going to mention two more rights that are again slightly different from everything I have mentioned so far. We have freedom of discrimination, and that is different because it's an umbrella right? You can be discriminated in any number of ways. You can be discriminated with regards to your health. You can be discriminated with regards to your shelter. You can be discriminated with regards to whether you're allowed to talk or not. So discrimination, if you want, is a right that is a right on its own, but is also a right that connects to every single other right. And you can be discriminated on different grounds. You can be discriminated because of your gender, because of your sexual orientation, because of your race, because of your religion, because of your political beliefs. And then finally, I have one right that is truly different to everything else I have mentioned so far, and that is the right to a clean environment. And the reason it's truly different is because we're not even sure if it's a right. And these rights we tend to call third generation rights. And they are, if you want, something that we would all very much like to enjoy, but it's not entirely clear, or at least there are debates within academics, whether they should be protected by courts or whether it should be the job of other political actors, namely policymakers, to protect them. Okay, so this is just a list. The list goes on and on. This is just a short list of the human rights most people think about when they come across this term. What we will do today is I will try and give you the basics of how these human rights are protected in practice. internationally. You can protect human rights on two levels, okay? You can protect human rights within your own country. And you do that, legally speaking, by going to a court and saying, I have a right to be free from torture, this policeman tortured me, and I deserve compensation and he should be sanctioned somehow. And your domestic court, if you're lucky and you live in a country that does protect human rights, the domestic court of your country will provide you with a remedy, will decide that you deserve some kind of compensation and that the policeman should be punished. If that doesn't work, if for a reason that the court believes that there has been no human rights violation, that is not the end of the story. Most countries have signed up to international conventions. That means that if you have exhausted domestic remedies in your own country, in other words, if you have gone to every single court in your country and you have lost, then you still have the opportunity to go to an international forum and argue your case there. And if the international forum agrees with you that there has been a human rights violation, it is your country's legal obligation to respond and to remedy you. So obviously each country has its own specific mechanisms of protecting human rights, but on the international level, everyone plays by the same rules. And it is these rules that I will try and summarize for you today, just so you get an idea of how do we actually protect human rights in real life, in international law. Okay, so before I start with some history of human rights and the institutions of human rights, which we will focus on later on, I just want to make a very basic distinction about human rights, and this is a common misconception among lay people, among people who don't deal professionally with human rights on a day-to-day basis. We have human rights that we call absolute, and we have human rights that we call relative. Very, very few human rights are absolute. And what do I mean by absolute? I mean, an absolute right is a right that can never be limited, that can never be interfered with by the state. Let me give you two examples of absolute rights, the two most well-known examples of absolute rights, that is freedom from torture and freedom from slavery. Let's start from the second one, freedom from slavery. When I say that freedom from slavery is an absolute right, I mean that under no circumstances are you allowed, or is the state allowed, to turn a human being into a slave. There is nothing that justifies turning someone into a slave. So as soon as a person proves that he was subjected to slavery conditions, the violation has been satisfied. Yes, has been proven. There is no response that the state can make that goes along the lines, yes, we did turn him into a slave, but we had good reasons for that. There are simply no good reasons for turning someone into a slave. The same goes for freedom from torture. As soon as someone proves that they have been tortured, there is nothing the state can say that excuses that or justifies that. You might be thinking of the ticking time bomb scenario. It's a very well-known scenario. We are in the middle of Manhattan. We know for a fact that a bomb will go off in half an hour. We don't have time to evacuate the city. And we have apprehended someone that we think knows where the bomb is. Are we allowed to torture him so that we can get the information to save millions? okay, there are several problems with this scenario. The most basic one, or I'll come up with two basic problems. The first problem is that it has been empirically proven that people lie under torture. So if the objective is to get to the truth, torturing the person will be counterproductive. The other problem is that you can never be entirely sure that person is the person you're looking for. So you might in fact be torturing an innocent. And if you're thinking at the back of your mind, well, yes, maybe, but torturing one innocent is fine. If what you're saving is millions, then my reply to you is, yes, sure, go ahead and torture his children. Then that is much more likely to be effective than torturing himself. If you're comfortable with that, then I guess the conversation is kind of over. But I hope you understand what kind of dilemmas we're talking about. But even in that dilemma, okay, even in the ticking time bomb scenario, the law, I'm not saying you cannot disagree with it, but the law states that you're not allowed to torture. And the reason you're not allowed to torture is because freedom from torture is an absolute right, okay? There is no circumstance that the law can think of that allows the state to torture an individual, okay? So these are what we call absolute rights. The vast majority of rights, however, are relative rights. And what do I mean by relative rights? I mean that on the one hand of the scale of the balance, you have the right. And on the other, you might have a good reason for limiting that right. Okay, so let me give you an example, freedom of expression. Okay, I have the right to say whatever I want, okay, to express myself however I want, to express even controversial opinions, okay? That is not an absolute right. I am not allowed to say whatever I want. An example being, if I'm a spy, yes, I work for the government, I spy for the government, I'm not allowed to share my trade secrets. I'm not allowed to go on the news and say what it is I have spied for the government. And the reason for that is, there are very important national security considerations here. My freedom of expression has to be limited for the greater good. And we're all comfortable with that. Let me give you a more topical example, a more recent example. I have the right to liberty. That means I'm allowed to walk, I'm allowed to go wherever I want. I am not to be restricted, yes, in my movements, unless I am a prisoner or unless I am in a mental institution and so on and so forth. So these are exceptions, but generally speaking, the average person is not to be limited in their movements, yes? Yet we all went into lockdown a couple of months ago, and most of us understood that it was a necessary and justified thing to do because there was a public health emergency. Okay, so there, our right to liberty was put on a scale against the health of the society at large. We weighed the two, and we agreed that we can legitimately limit this right for the greater good. Okay, so this balancing exercise is what defines relative rights. There is no such balancing exercise with absolute rights. Yes, you never put on a scale someone's freedom from torture and say, yes, but it makes economic sense to torture them because, I don't know, it will save us money. Yes, it never works that way. There is never a counterweight on the balance when we're talking about absolute rights, but there is a counterweight on the balance when we're talking about relative rights. And I am stressing this and I am re-stressing it, because when you hear someone say, yes, but I have a right to do X or to do Y, they may well have a right to do X or Y, but that doesn't mean that they are legally allowed to do it. They might be stopped from doing it because there are very good reasons for stopping someone from doing it. Yes. Let me give you one someone might have a right to be educated in their own language. Yes, that falls under freedom of education. But if their own language is a language that is spoken by 2 other persons in the country, it might not make financial sense for the state to provide teachers and textbooks for those 2 people. Yes, while it might make sense to provide teachers and textbooks if instead of 2 people we were talking about 2,000 people. Okay, so this is in a nutshell how we conceptualize human rights in court. Yes, it is for this reason that courts are important, because they perform this balancing exercise. They are given the responsibility for saying, yes, we have a really important consideration on the one hand, human rights. We have potentially another important consideration on the other. How do we achieve the best balance between them? Okay, so all of these discussions about balance and about human rights started towards the end of the 1700s with the French Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789, which for the first time declared a right to liberty, a right to property, a right in security, and a right to resistance to oppression. And it is what led to the French Revolution. A few years after that, we have the first constitution that codifies human rights, and that is the US Bill of Rights in 1791. During these decades, there are theoretical and philosophical discussions between those who think that human rights are important and necessary, like John Stuart Mill, and those who think that, as Bentham famously put it, human rights are elevated nonsense. They made no sense to Bentham whatsoever. I guess the wind, you can call it, the wind went to John Stuart Mill when, after the Second World War, it became immediately and glaringly obvious that we cannot live humanely in a world that does not protect human rights. Okay, so the war stops in 1945, and almost immediately after, in 1948, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this is the first truly international document that lists human rights and strives for their protection. Now, while the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is symbolically important, it is only that, just symbolically important. And the reason for that is because it does not have a legally binding effect. In other words, you can point to it and say, look at these nice ideas that it makes reference to, but you cannot take it to a court and say, I want my human rights protected because of this document. The first legally binding international human rights instruments came about 20 years later, in 1966, through 2 international conventions: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And the reason we have 2 covenants and we have split human rights into 2, civil and political rights on the one hand and economic and social rights on the other, is because the world was split into 2 because of the Cold War. So communist states were proponents of socioeconomic rights, like the right to health, the right to housing, and said it is the state's responsibility to provide these. And then the West was a proponent of civil and political rights, like freedom from torture, like the right to fair trial, like freedom of expression. And the argument in the West was, it's really not the state's responsibility to provide you with a home. Go and find your home. It is, however, the state's responsibility to stop you. It is the state's responsibility to stop from interfering in your liberties. It is its responsibility to allow you to express yourself, to allow you to vote for whoever you want, to allow you to exercise your religion however you want. My 2 cents are that it doesn't really make sense anymore, 30 years after the end of the Cold War, to be talking about 2 different types of rights. They are really one and the same. It makes little sense to have the right to life, which is a civil and political right, if you don't have the right to food, which is a socio-economic right. So the reason I'm referring to this distinction today is, even though the Cold War is over, the 2 instruments that the Cold War gave rise to, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights on the one hand, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights on the other, they are still the law of the land. Yes, they are still what we have to work with. Now, in addition to these 2 key instruments that together list most, if not all, human rights, we have a number of specific instruments that were devised in order to address specific human rights violations. So there are several of these. I can't possibly come up with a list of them, but let me give you a few examples. You have the International Convention on the Elimination on all forms of racial discrimination. Okay, that what it does is in the name. It tackles racism. We have the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. Again, this is specifically designed to tackle sexism. We have a specific convention against torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. We have a convention on the rights of the child, which is the most widely ratified treaty in the world. 2 states have not ratified it. Every other state in the world has. Rather embarrassing for it. One of the 2 states is the United States. And then we have the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Okay, these are just examples, and they are international and global treaties. What I mean by global is that they have member states from every continent in the world. If you take the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it has been ratified, as I said, by every country other than 2. So if Australia is a member state, and Chile is a member state, and Nigeria is a member state, and Latvia is a member state, and there is no geographical limitation on who can be a member state. On the other hand, we also have important regional human rights documents. Okay, we have the European Convention on Human Rights, we have the American Convention on Human Rights, we have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and we have the Asian Human Rights Charter. These are geographically limited. In other words, you cannot join the European Convention on Human Rights unless you are a European state. Okay, you cannot join the American Convention on Human Rights unless the country is in the continent of the Americas. Okay, and the very last convention that I'm going to make reference to is the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. That is again a European instrument. Okay, so if I am to rank these human rights protections geographically, at the narrowest level, you start with the domestic protection, the protection you get in your country. If you live in Cyprus, that is the protection you derive from the Cypriot constitution. Okay, and then if that does not protect you sufficiently, you can resort to the international level. And the international level is really divided into 2 that are not, one is not above from the other, they are on the same level hierarchically. You have on the one hand the European protection, so you can use the European Convention on Human Rights in order to protect your rights, and then you have the global protection. You can resort to any of the United Nations instruments like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in order to protect the rights that have been infringed. Okay, I hope this makes sense. Let me now start zooming in on the institutions. I already referred to the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the ICESCR, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Each of these covenants has a court that interprets the wording of the covenant. In other words, if there is a case on the right to life, there might be disagreement on what exactly do we mean by life. Let me give you a more practical example. Who has the right to life? Does an embryo have a right to life, or does life begin with birth? Does a person who is in a persistent vegetative state, in a long-term coma, does that person have a right to life, or has their life, to all intents and purposes, ended? Okay, so these questions of interpretation are decided by courts. Rather confusingly, the court that interprets the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is called the Human Rights Committee, and the court that interprets the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is called the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Okay, so in addition to these committees, we have committees for every other covenant out there. So we have the Committee Against Torture, we have the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, we have the Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, we have the Committee on the Rights of the Child. In addition to all these bodies, at the regional level, so in Europe, in America, in Africa, and so on and so forth, we have courts that interpret the regional human rights instruments. So the European Convention on Human Rights is interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights. Yes, the American Convention of Human Rights is interpreted by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights is interpreted by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And if you're thinking to yourself, oh my God, how many human rights bodies are there? The answer is maybe too many, okay? And that results in a cacophony, yes? It doesn't always result in this beautiful music of human rights. And the reason for that is because one court might decide that a human right is to be interpreted in one way, and another court is going to decide that a human right is interpreted in another way. So how your human rights are protected, to a certain extent, depends on where you live. And let me give you an example of that. If you live in Europe, the right to life begins with the first breath. Yes, as soon as you take your first breath, you're considered a human being, and human beings have the right to life protected. If you live in the Americas, if you live in Latin America, the right to life begins on conception. Okay, so embryos are also protected by the right to life, and there is no persuasive explanation for this distinction other than culture and religion. Europeans simply interpreted these rights differently than the Americans because they had different cultural and religious influences. Okay, so I want to take a minute here to say a few words about the European Convention on Human Rights, and the reason I'm focusing on this is because this is a European project that is funded in the summer school, but also because the European Human Rights framework is by far the most developed in the world. So if you live in Europe, you are benefiting from the greatest human rights protections that one can benefit from worldwide. So let me say a few words about the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights. The ECHR is the court of an organization called the Council of Europe. That organization is not to be confused with the European Union. The European Union is an organization that is different, entirely distinct, entirely separate from the Council of Europe. Yes, the Council of Europe has 47 member states. These include Russia and Turkey. Okay, the European Union does not. It has 27 member states, so 20 states less. And these include Sweden, that is, or let me give you an easier to follow example. These include Germany, okay? And Germany is a member state of both the Council of Europe and the European Union. And Cyprus. Cyprus is a member state of both the European Union and the Council of Europe. And I don't know, Latvia, okay? But there are countries that are not member states to both. Yes, an example is the UK. The UK is not a member of the European Union anymore, but is a member of the Council of Europe. Another example, as I mentioned, is Turkey. Turkey is not a member state of the European Union, but is a member state of the Council of Europe. The European Union's job is to protect and create an internal market. Okay? The job of the Council of Europe is to protect human rights. There is some overlap between the two, so the two organizations that are both based in Europe tend to cooperate with each other, and there is great respect between the two, but they are entirely distinct. Okay, so when we are talking about the European Court of Human Rights, do not think that that is the court of the European Union. The court of the European Union is called the European Court of Justice or the Court of Justice of the European Union. So we have two European courts. Yes, the Court of Justice of the European Union deals with free market questions. Okay, am I, a Cypriot, allowed to establish my business in Germany in the same way that a German person is? That kind of questions. And the European Court of Human Rights is dealing with questions that have to do with human rights. I don't know, am I a prisoner in the UK allowed to vote in British elections? Or should my right be restricted? Okay, so how do we actually protect human rights in practice? There are several mechanisms through which human rights protection takes place. Most of them are inefficient. Okay, let me give you a few examples of mechanisms that are there, but are not working very well. Every member state to the ICCPR, to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has an obligation to submit reports to the Human Rights Committee every 5 years that explain what kind of human rights improvements have taken place in the last 5 years in the country. So a report is sent, if it is sent. If it's not sent, there is no international police to do anything about it. Yes, a report is sent to the Human Rights Committee, drafted by government officials, and it says, in this last 5-year period, we had these many violations by policemen, and these are the measures we took. This is the training we undertook. This is the punishment we gave out in order to address this. Okay, and it is the state's responsibility to paint an accurate picture of the human rights violations that have taken place. And if it doesn't, there is very little that the Human Rights Committee can do. Okay? And if it does paint an accurate picture, and it's a problematic picture, again, there is very little the Human Rights Committee can do. The Human Rights Committee will issue a reply report, and in that response, it will say, we are very disappointed that not more has been done to protect human rights, and please do better in the next 5-year period. And I guess that's something, yes, but it's not great. Because of the limitations of this approach and other similar approaches, it became evident very early on that the best way of protecting human rights is to give the responsibility and the power to individuals to protect themselves. So if my human right has been violated, human rights law allows me to take my country to court and say, my country has violated my rights. So let me give you an example. If I come home one day and I realize that someone has come into my house and has searched it, and it's clear that that someone was the police and there was no warrant, yes, that is a violation of my right to home and my right to private life. There is no one who is more incentivized than myself to do something about it. So human rights law allows me, an individual, just a person, to take a whole country to court, yes, and argue that a country's institution, in this case the police, violated my personal rights. Yes, my private life, my human rights. That sounds, I don't know, to someone who's not very familiar with international law, that might sound okay, good for you, but it's really special, yes, because there is no other area of international law that gives rights to individuals to take states to court. Yes, states are on an entirely different level from individuals. States in international law are so much more important than individuals that we don't even look at individuals. Individuals are just, they don't register on the radar. Yes, international law is simply concerned with the relationships between states. Yes, one important player against another important player, one state against another state. Human rights law has revolutionized this relationship by saying, no, the individual is also important. Yes, the human, that one person whose rights you have violated is allowed to come after you and demand some kind of remedy. Yes, and not always, but often, individuals do go to court and do go after their own states and do say, this state has violated my rights, and win. And when they win, laws get changed and compensation gets paid. Yes? Okay, one last thing that I want to say. I mentioned before in passing something that is, I'm sure, something that you already know. There's no such thing as an international police. So what happens if I go after Cyprus, me, a Cypriot citizen, I go after Cyprus in the international court in the European Court of Human Rights, and I argue and I win a case, and now the court says Cyprus has a responsibility to remedy the applicant. Yes, Cyprus has a responsibility to give me compensation or to change the law. Can't Cyprus simply ignore the decision? Well, yes, is the simple answer. Cyprus can ignore the decision, but it doesn't. Yes, and it's not just Cyprus. It's big states as well. Yes, Denmark doesn't ignore ECHR decisions. Germany doesn't ignore ECHR decisions. The UK mostly follows ECHR decisions. Even Turkey and Russia mostly follow ECHR decisions. And the reason I say even is because historically and statistically, these are the two countries that have tended to ignore the court to the greatest extent. But even these countries that have tended to ignore the court to the greatest extent, by and large, follow it. By and large, respect it. And the reason for that is the Committee of Ministers. The Committee of Ministers is a sister body to the ECHR. Yes, it's a body that falls under the same organization. And it meets every 3 months, okay? And in this body, representatives from each government meet. And they exert pressure on other states in order to implement their human rights decisions, in order to follow their human rights obligations. So if you have a case against the UK, okay, let's take the prisoner disenfranchisement case. I am a prisoner, the court has ruled that even though I'm a prisoner, I should be allowed to vote, and the UK is refusing to let me vote. What happens every few months is all the member states meet up and they exert pressure on the UK in order to change its law. And the reason that the tool they have at hand to do that is the ECHR decision. They tell it, the court has decided that your law is problematic, go and fix it. And the pressure is such that states do fix their laws. Not immediately, not always, but change gradually and positively takes place. Okay, so that was the general introduction to human rights. From this session, you should have gathered the general idea of how human rights came to be. The answer is they mushroomed after the Second World War. Even though we had human rights discussions before that, the boom that created the Big Bang of the human rights evolution was the Second World War, when we realized that we really cannot live without them as a species. Okay, and you should also have an idea of what we mean by relative and absolute rights, and that courts are responsible for striking a balance between considerations when it comes to relative rights. And then you should have an idea of how practically do we protect human rights. So through what kind of institutions, which has been the biggest part of this discussion. I hope you find the summer school useful. It was lovely talking to you. Bye.